hot topic over the last few years, and we are pleased to present to you Stuart Binstock, who's the former president and CEO of the Construction Financial Management Association and currently a consultant to the construction industry, as well as Sonia Bowman, who is the executive director of the CIASP, which is Construction Industry Alliance for Suicide Prevention. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and turn the screen over to you. We certainly appreciate you taking time out of your day to speak to our group.
Thank you, Rhett. Thanks, Rhett and Brian, for the invitation. We're very excited to be here and to be able to speak about this topic. I actually, just to clarify one thing, I am actually on the board of trustees of the CIASP. So while I am a consultant to the construction industry these days, that's my reason for being here, is as a member of the trustee of the CIASP. I saw Brent Knight, who I think is actually the reason why we're speaking here today. Brent saw me at a conference a few months ago and asked if I could speak to this group. So I guess at least one of you thought this was worthwhile having me speak. So hopefully the rest of you will feel the same way afterwards. Sonia's going to help me with the slides and also with her expertise on this topic as we talk together quite frequently. So thanks for the invitation. We're really excited to be here. You know, as many of you know, or probably all of you know, it's Construction Safety Week. I'm wearing my safety vest, which I received when I gave a presentation in Dallas, Texas on Monday. It's been a busy week, and there's a lot of activities related to Construction Safety Week. I want to applaud you for focusing on mental health. Before we started talking formally in the presentation, there was a little side conversation, and we were talking about how the safety and health community has done a great job of talking about physical health, a little reluctant to talk about mental health. And this is important, as our friend Cal Beyer, who many of you may know because Cal spent some time in Washington, when Cal would talk about this topic, he would always talk about removing the stigma. And that's really a main purpose of all of our presentations, is to remove the stigma. We don't intend to make anybody a professional in mental health. That's not the objective. The objective is to start the conversation and give you some tools that'll help you maybe see the warning signs and why this industry has such a huge problem. I usually start almost all of my presentations off with a story that about 8 years ago, when we first started this initiative. I tell this story because I think it brings home why this is such an important topic. And I know some of you, if you haven't experienced the suicide, might think, oh, this is kind of blown out of proportion. Well, I think this story kind of confirms that's not the case. So I was talking to an electrical contractor, and I started telling him about what we were doing in the area of suicide prevention. And his eyes kind of bugged out at me. And he said, how'd you find out about us? I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. He said, well, you must be telling me this because you know what happened to our company. I said, no, I don't know what happened to your company. He said, we lost 3 people to suicide in the last 18 months. The last one was a superintendent who hung himself in the boiler room of a Fortune 100 company. Well, you can just start to imagine the impact of that on the company. The spouse of the person who died sued the company, blaming them for the suicide. The Fortune 100 company made the president of the company come to their location and explain how they could continue to work given what had happened on the job site. This is a safety issue. It's a risk management issue. You know, when we first started out, a lot of people thought, we were kind of do-gooders and we were doing the right thing. Well, that's an element of this, but you can look at this from a risk management and safety perspective as well. And it's important. I know I've worked with contractors for 40 years now, and they do look at the bottom line. They look at the nuts and bolts. And if you want to look at the bottom line, this can have a very major impact on your company or any company if you unfortunately have to deal with a situation like this. I usually ask at this time, when I can see everybody, a show of hands of folks who have died by know of someone who has died by suicide, either on the job site or personally. I won't do that today. It seems like it'll be a little, well, I guess people could raise their hands, and they already are. And there's a lot of them. and this doesn't surprise me because every time I ask this question, it's a surprising number. I did ask the question in California to a general contractor, to his the superintendents of that company. There were about 60 to 70 people in the room, and about half of them raised their hand. So please, thank God if you haven't experienced this yet, but if you have, you know the impact and how this can impact a company. If you don't remember anything else from what my presentation today, remember 988, which is the hotline to call for information for if someone is in distress. So if you know someone or either yourself, but remember that 988 is an important number to remember. Okay, let's move it along here, Sonia. So my title did say I was the former CEO of the Construction Financial Management Association. So we represent, they still represent, I'm retired, but they represent about 10,000 people around the country. Mostly 60 to 65% are CFOs, controllers who work for construction companies. And I guess the question is, how did a bunch of financial people, how did a bunch of accountants lead the effort in suicide prevention? And I don't want to give you guys a rough time, but the safety professions clearly did not want to talk about this 7 or 8 years ago. And this was a topic that gentleman I mentioned before, Cal Beyer, and he wrote an article with somebody else. We published that article and it was on suicide prevention. We had never talked about the subject before that article. And the way I describe it is there was a tsunami of activity. The people just came out of the woodwork telling their stories, telling how they had friends, relatives, coworkers who had experienced suicide. And we realized this was way bigger than a bunch of accountants trying to tackle this issue. So, and then of course, Rhett mentioned the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, ranked construction around this time as the #1 occupation for deaths by suicide. So we realized very quickly we needed to form an organization, an umbrella organization that would represent the entire industry. And that's why in 2018, we formed the Construction Industry Alliance for Suicide Prevention, which Sonia is the executive director of. So that organization is really our attempt to bring the entire industry together to talk about this issue. And as you can see, our vision is a zero suicide construction industry. We're a long way off from that. We'll talk a little bit about why that is in a moment. Sonia, go ahead. Why don't you talk about this? I know this is a subject that you're very good at talking about.
Thank you, Stuart. And thank you everyone for being here and having this conversation. You know, Stuart talked a little bit about, and we were having a conversation before everyone jumped on about removing the stigma. And that's why it's so important that we level set with some language before we jump into the rest of this conversation. You know, I would say even 10 years ago, we would whisper about diseases like cancer and other physical ailments. And that is really how we're still talking about suicide. And the more that we can bring this conversation to the forefront in a compassionate and destigmatizing way, really will allow us to be able to talk about mental health just like we talk about physical health. And one of those ways to do that is to remove some of the negative connotations that are specific to the conversation around suicide. So rather than use the term commit, which is what all of us were taught to use when we were talking about this subject, is that we change that vernacular to died by suicide. And the reason that we stopped talking about commit is that there's some very strong beliefs or connotations around that word, some of which go back to the fact that up until the 70s, it was actually a crime to die by suicide. The other is from a cultural or religious standpoint, and that associates it with a sin and it being the ultimate sin that you can no longer come back from. And while some of those cultures and some realities may still exist, that is how people feel about this conversation, it's really important that we are supportive and open to people that are struggling with mental illness and make it easier for them to have a conversation or to share their own feelings, which is also why we try to label the conversation. So instead of saying someone is crazy or they are bipolar, we want to change that terminology to things like they have bipolar or they are struggling with a mental illness. And it's really important when we have this conversation, especially on our job sites, that when someone brings up the conversation of mental health or mental illness, that we are not labeling them as weak or selfish or thinking about a suicide attempt as a selfish behavior, because just like any other illness, it is just that. And we wouldn't talk about someone going through cancer treatments as selfish. And so we want to apply those same parameters to a mental health condition as well. So Stuart, I will pass it back to you to talk a little bit about what CIASP believes.
So thanks, Sonia. Before I get to this slide, I do want to talk about the die versus commit. You know, the in the networks and TV, you will still hear people talk about commit, but then you also will hear some people actually start talking about die by. So the vernacular is changing. It hasn't changed completely, but if you pay close attention to reports about someone who's died by suicide, you'll hear both. But we'd like that to change and talk about it instead of committing suicide, die by. So what do we believe? Well, we believe construction work is noble. Every suicide is preventable. I think the one I want to really focus on is physical safety, includes mental health. That's why we're here. And I think that's a very important change that has happened over the last 7 to 10 years. Every person should have access to mental health resources. We'll talk a couple of times during this presentation about employee assistance plans. For those of you who weren't on at the very, very beginning, Sonia and I were talking to Brian, and I mentioned that I gave a presentation on Monday, this very similar presentation. And after the presentation, 2 employees went up to management and asked for some information about their employee assistance plan, trying to get help for some mental issues that they were dealing with. Nothing makes me feel better than that, to hear that we made a difference and that people wanted to explore how they could use their EAP. There are a couple of words that you've never heard in the construction industry, and that is a caring culture. We'll talk a little bit about that, but we really feel like this needs to change. The industry, for its own survival, actually needs to change. It'll be very hard to recruit in an industry that has the highest incident rate of suicide, is a very physically demanding. And so there's got to be some changes in the culture of the industry and of specific companies. And very important, every construction organization, regardless of its size, can make a meaningful impact on suicide prevention. It may be different depending on the size of your company, but everybody should be thinking about what they can do to stem the tide on this issue. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but this talks about the impact of COVID. I think, you know, we had a mental health issue and a mental health problem in the industry, and it was exacerbated by COVID. So there's some kind of older statistics in terms of years, but still relevant. In 2020, U.S. adults reported poorer mental health conditions due to the pandemic. 42% of construction workers reported feeling more anxious or depressed in 20 than in 19. And the prevalence in workers was 15%, was particularly high in those particular categories. Sonia, is there anything else on this slide that I should focus on?
I think it's just really important to share that, you know, what we saw leading into COVID was that some of the numbers were trending down, and unfortunately they have spiked again because there's some residual anxiety and depression coming out of COVID, and it is affecting the younger workers that are joining the construction workforce the most. And it's just something we need to keep on our radars for sure.
Great, thanks. So why do we need to address this issue in the construction workforce? In 2017, 38,000 people in working age died by suicide, a 40% increase in less than 20 years. The suicide rate in this country, this is a national problem. There's no question about that. but construction workers are at a greater risk of suicide than the average worker, as we mentioned, is rated #1 in terms of rate of suicide. And it impacts all levels of the industry. I think a lot of people might think maybe kind of the labor workforce, the trades are impacted the most, but there is a problem at the management level as well. And one of the things and one of the reasons why this industry has such a high suicide rate is male construction workers have a suicide rate 65% higher than all U.S. male workers, and males in general have a higher suicide rate than females. So what are the construction risk factors? This is kind of one of the key elements that we like to focus on when we talk about this. So chronic pain. Obviously, it's an industry where people get hurt. People get hurt. We'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about opioids. They take opioids, they get hooked on opioids, and people die by suicide. I believe somebody spoke right at the very beginning and said there were 2 deaths that she was aware of in your area, and one was an overdose. This is not unusual. Very unfortunate, but it's not unusual. The industry also has extreme pressure, promotes supervisors without leadership training. So some of the things we're talking about, your management may not be as knowledgeable about, should be, but is not. And then there's sometimes a skills gap where people feel stuck in their particular job in the industry. And then maybe the biggest one that I always focus on is that stoic, tough guy culture. That is definitely the culture in the construction industry. You don't talk about your feelings. You don't talk about if you're having a mental health issue. That leads to a lot of problems. That leads to a lot of mental health issues that go undiagnosed. Some other areas, people, construction company will take a job 1,000 miles away. They'll ask their workforce to go and travel 1,000 miles away. You're working in isolation and separate from your family. That can have a real impact on someone's mental health. And then on the other side, people get laid off in the industry, and you have financial instability, which can also cause mental health issues. And then access to lethal means. I would certainly say there's a gun culture in the construction industry. Guns are, guys go out hunting. So people have access to lethal means. That's a problem. It is easy. I don't know how to put this other than it is easier to die by suicide if you have a gun than any other way. Veterans are known to have a very high suicide rate. I think the number I remember hearing was 32 veterans die every day by suicide, which is a absolutely shocking and startling number. But that adds to the construction industry numbers because a lot of veterans end up working in the workforce in the construction industry after they retire from the military. And then alcohol and substance abuse is also pretty common in the industry, and those can lead to problems in mental health as well. And then I think these are our last construction risk factors. Demographics, I already mentioned that men have a higher suicide rate than women, and it is largely a male workforce. You guys get up at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. It's probably late for some of you. So you deal with sleep deprivation, sleep disruption. And I touched on this before, poor access to utilization of behavioral health care. Well, that's my way of saying access to support through an employee assistance plan. All EAPs are not created equal. And what we find is that, based on my presentation on Monday, people really don't even know they exist. So it's very, very important to talk about your employee assistance plans. So ignoring it is not an answer. We don't have a mental health suicide problem. That is, frankly, I think what the industry used to say, but I think the tide has turned in a positive direction about talking about this. It meant ignoring it is not an answer, and we do have a mental health suicide problem. So how can this be woven into your existing management practices? So we talk about upstream, midstream, and downstream. I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but I will talk a little bit more later about the caring culture. Very important. I think we need to change the paradigm in the construction industry. Identify and promote resources. If you go onto our website, you will find a host of information on what to look for. PreventConstructionSuicide.com. I believe my last slide probably references that. Midstream, education on warning signs. I'm going to talk in a moment about what are the warning signs. Connecting to care, as we talked about EAPs, and downstream, when unfortunately when something has happened, company needs to manage the crisis. There are many companies that have a strict prohibition about having guns on the job site. I would strongly recommend you do that. And if you unfortunately have to deal with something like this, you probably are going to need to have a crisis response management team set up as well. So mental health is a workplace concern. These are some staggering numbers. 1 in 5 adults will experience mental illness, 52.9 million people, and 60% are left untreated. And what do they have? 6.9% have depression, 18.1% have anxiety. And forget about someone dying by suicide, just the lost productivity can lead up to 27 lost work days per year. That's 1/12 of their time on the job. 17 million people can experience a co-occurring substance use disorder and mental illness in 2020. So you can throw a couple of these up there. So depression and anxiety cost the global economy $1 trillion. Depression is the first leading cause of disability. And similar to what it said up top, when employees are depressed, they miss an average of 31.4 days per year. And mental and nervous conditions are ranked number 3 in all of the disability claims in the industry. But there is hope, and there is something that you need to think about, and that is a $1 investment in mental health results in a $4 return on investment. So it pays to think about this and to approach this issue in a serious fashion. So the warning signs. If I had some people talk who knew someone who had died by suicide, frequently when I asked people to talk about this during my presentation, people said there were no warning signs. Someone died by suicide, and we had no idea until it happened. And that happens quite often. But there are some warning signs, and there are some things that you should be aware of and think about. And Sonia, I believe we have cards where this is available from our organization.
We do indeed. We have the warning signs available that people can order wallet cards from us. We also have it as a downloadable right on our website, I believe. And if you can't find it there, we can certainly send it out to you so that you, and in poster size, that you can print and put up on any job site.
Great, thanks, Sonia. So what are they saying? They're talking about feeling trapped. They're actually saying that they want to die. They feel like they're a burden to others, expressing hopelessness and conflict or confrontations with coworkers. What are they doing? They're increasingly absent or tardy. You can see decreased productivity. There are near misses on the job site. They're misusing drugs or alcohol, acting anxious, agitated, withdrawing from social interactions, and extreme mood swings. And what's happening in their lives? Well, these are, unfortunately, common things that happen with everybody. Relationship issues, major life changes, loss of a loved one, financial difficulties, and illness or injury. So this is really just a rehash of what was in the middle column there, performance issues that can be warning signs. Just these are things to really pay attention to. If you notice these, then you probably want to approach someone and ask them how they're doing. You know,
Stuart, can I just add here something?
yeah.
So what often happens when we're talking about some of those warning signs is that specifically on a job site, they will often show up as what appears to be a performance problem. And so our gut reaction when we have a performance issue is to discipline as if it were a performance issue rather than digging a little bit deeper. I recently did a panel discussion in Washington, D.C., and one of the safety professionals on the panel discussion said, get to know your people, because what you're really looking for is patterns and changes of behavior. So if you have someone who comes to work all the time and is punctual or even early, and then suddenly you start to see a change in that pattern of behavior and they start coming in late, well, our gut reaction is to look at that as a performance issue and to address it as such. But dig a little bit deeper, find out specifically, what is going on with them, and see if maybe there are a series of those warning signs that kind of string together to start making you think that there's a bigger issue than somebody is just not doing their job, but they're maybe not feeling right, and that there's a bigger problem to look at.
Great point, Sonia. These issues are symptomatic of possibly a mental health issue. So what do you do? I just mentioned that if you see these issues, what should you be doing with that particular employee? They're in Australia, they have a program called Are You Okay? And it is a nationwide program, and it is simply to walk up to someone, to walk up to a coworker and say, are you okay? It's as simple as that. And that is something, it's as simple as doing that on the job site as well. But here's a very kind of specific way of approaching this. The acronym is TASK, stands for tune in, ask, state, and connect. So tune in when you notice or sense that a person is struggling with some of the warning signs that we just mentioned. Focus your attention on them. Ask if they're thinking about suicide, clearly, directly, and calmly, and without judgment. This is always the one that surprises me, and this is the one why I always tell people we're not mental health professionals. We don't expect you to become a mental health professional. But the professionals say, my first inclination when I saw this is, I don't want to give somebody the idea of thinking about doing that wasn't thinking about that. But the mental health professionals say that you should ask this clearly, directly, and calmly, and it will help you figure out whether that person is in that kind of state of mind. State that suicide is serious, and connect that, and that connecting to help is important, and then connect them to a person helping resources who know suicide first aid skills. It has been said, if you do have someone who you know is suicidal, you really should not leave them alone. You should connect them with somebody before you leave them by themselves. So what is a caring culture? I've mentioned it a couple of times. It's not something known to the construction industry, and I don't say that critically. I've worked in and around the industry for about 40 years, so I love the industry and I think a great deal of it, but this is not its strong point. So, here's some things you can do from a management standpoint. Leadership support, encouragement, injury management programs. So instead of people, getting hurt, taking opioids, create upfront an injury management program and a return to work and a pain management program that doesn't require opioids. Consider the person and their needs in scheduling, assigning out-of-time jobs. I mentioned that's one of the issues that causes the problem. Here's the way to counteract that. Create, encourage peer supporting relationships, building teams. Having people walk up and just saying, "Are you okay?" would help. Personal finance is a problem sometimes in all industries and with all workers. And having some kind of personal finance management education, personal finance can cause a lot of hardships with people sometimes. So trying to address that is important as well. Reduce job site access to lethal means. I've mentioned that a couple of times already. Gun safety education is kind of one of the responses to that. Confirm access to benefits. Educate employees on their EAP. Substance abuse education, screening programs, second chance agreements. I think it's, if someone has a substance abuse problem and you let them go, I'm not saying that that's not an appropriate approach, but it could lead to them going downhill rapidly as well. Can you think of a different way? Can you think of another way to salvage them as an employee? Staff projects appropriately, have reasonable expectations. Train management supervisors in these soft skills. We have, I'll turn to Sonia again. We have something called the Learning Works training program. Sonia, you want to talk a little bit about that?
And I always forward the slide instead of taking myself off mute. Yes, we do have Living Work Start training on our website. It's an introduction to suicide prevention. It's about a 90-minute training that is 100% virtual. So if you move through the modules a little bit faster, you can get through it a little bit faster, but it typically takes about 90 minutes. It is 100% free. You log onto our website and then you ask for a license and we will send that to you. And then you can log on at your leisure and go ahead and take that training. That's really the first step in the training process that Living Works offers. They do offer 2 other in-person trainings that are a little bit more detailed, but it is absolutely one I would recommend to everyone who wants to start having an introduction on how to have that conversation, just like those 4 steps that you detailed a few minutes ago.
Great, thanks. We can go to the next slide, Sonia. So here are some resources. We have toolbox talks that you can use for free. We just talked about Living Works. Here it is. And then there's a mental health screening that you can look at as well. I mentioned 988. And as I said, if you don't remember anything from my presentation, please remember that's the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. So let's talk about opioids for a second. Big problem in society, but arguably maybe even a bigger problem in construction, because people get hurt more often probably in the construction industry than any other industry. And according to the CDC, 1 out of 4 people prescribed opioids for long-term pain become addicted. That is an awful statistic, a shocking one, but one that I think is important to understand. And as I said, construction workers have one of the highest injury rates compared to other industries, making them more likely to be prescribed opioids. And obviously, construction workers often also rely on their bodies and often feel the need to overcome pain in order to work and get paid. So it becomes a necessity, and it's a rabbit hole for folks who start taking opioids. So opioids have no place in the workplace. So there have been I'm not sure what year this is, but there were 16,000 prescription opioid overdose deaths, and then 68,000 overall, which means my math is correct, about 52,000 people got them for non-prescriptions. And it is obviously there are legitimate uses for them when they're prescribed, but there are also illegitimate uses. It's a big problem. Let's look at the next slide, which I think is going to hit you right in between the eyes. So the duration of a use: 1 day, you have a 6% chance of still using the drug a year later. 7 days you take it, you have a 13.5% chance. If you are on opioids for a month, you have a 30% chance of becoming addicted. And long-term use leads to increased sensitivity to perception of pain, increased risk of depression, and increased risk of suicide. I can't stand another problem. While the women in the workforce is growing, women tend to use opioids more than men. And so this is a problem when we're bringing women into the workforce as well. So I won't spend a lot of time on this because but I'll give you briefly, we'll go through some of these. How to become a best class employer. The factor is tough guy mentality. We talked a little bit about this in the slide before. Zero tolerance for bullying, harassment, chronic pain, injury management programs. I think some of these things we already talked about, actually, Sonia. They were on that other slide, so I don't think we need to talk about these as well. Yeah, we can go through these. So drug-free workforce policies should be used as a safety and health tool for workers. You should update them to include random drug screens on employees in safety-sensitive positions, refer positive tests to an EAP that can evaluate and treat opioid use disorder, and educate employees about the dangers of opioids. If you've learned anything from this presentation, and hope you've learned that as well. And here are some resources related to opioid use. The CPWR, the Center for Construction Research and Training, has done an extensive amount of work in this area. There are a couple of other articles here that you can take a look at as well. And this is, I think, the last slide. Stand up for suicide prevention. That is our motto. We ask people to sign the pledge on our website, individuals, companies, just to show the sheer magnitude of interest in this issue. So if anyone's on this presentation and wants to go onto our website and sign up and stand up for suicide prevention, we'd love to see that. It's there's no obligation when you do that for anything other than representing that you support the initiatives of the Construction Industry Alliance for Suicide Prevention. So final slide, take the pledge, download resources, order supplies, access free training. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, our budget is strictly based on donations. And construction companies donate at times. Associations have helped us as well, but it's 100% based on donations. Anything you can do to help us, we would greatly appreciate. And I believe that is the last slide. And Brian and Rhett, I don't know if we have time for questions.
Absolutely. We appreciate the presentation. Thank you so much. I had a few people in the chat room request copies of the, PDF copies of the presentation because you had such wonderful statistics in there that could be shared with upper management or throughout an organization. So that would be fantastic if you could provide a PDF copy.
I have it, Rhett.
Okay,
Stuart
excellent.
already
Great.
sent it to me, so I got it.
Excellent. That's fantastic. And a lot of people will probably be reaching out to gather that information. We certainly appreciate you joining. Let's see here who we have raising their hand. We have Jennifer. I think, Jennifer, you'd raised your hand. I could be wrong, though, during the who knows, somebody that has had experienced suicide directly or indirectly. So, yeah, okay. Any other questions out there that you folks have? Great opportunity to chat it up. Let's see, I'm just scrolling